During the Qatar World Cup, I was traveling in the Middle East, and I had some interesting conversations with the locals along the way. One of the questions I was asked is why China is doing so bad at football, while doing so good outside of the football stadium. I did talk about issues like morale, training, corruption, and so on, but I figured it's much more than that, and I couldn't cover what I wanted to say in just 2 3 minutes, so I decided to make a video of it. In China, when it comes to the country or the government, there are a lot of forbidden zones where you're not supposed to talk about. But the national football team is an exception. You will get tons of likes and reposts if you make a good joke of the football team. Just recently, the chairman of a state owned company said in a press conference that his company will not be the China football team, but the China ping pong team. In fact, the China football team hasn't always been an embarrassment. It was quite strong back in the 80s, especially in East Asia. Nowadays, when people talk about strong teams in Asia, they think of Japan or South Korea. But 30 years ago, the football landscape in Asia was very different. When Japan defeated China in 1987 during the Olympic qualifying rounds, people in China were shocked because before that, China had never lost to Japan. As a turnaround, China did beat Japan later in the next game, but the rise of Japan was already on the horizon. Although there were some major setbacks, China football didn't just stop there. In 2001, China defeated Oman and got qualified for the World Cup for the very first time. I still remember that moment because the game was held in my hometown. In hindsight, that game wasn't the revival of Chinese football, but the beginning of a downward spiral. Of course, every football team in the world has its good days and bad days. But for China football, the ECG basically turned flat. And now people are talking about scraping the football system completely and start all over again. If you search some of the famous Chinese football players, most of them were born in the 70s and grew up in the 80s. Fan Zhiyi played defender for 3 seasons at Crystal Palace and was made captain in the 2000 season. More legendary is Sun Jihai, who impressed fans at Man City when he shot the post from 35 meters away with his left foot. He soon became the first East Asian player to ever score in the Premier League when he sent the ball straight to Birmingham City's gate with his head. Both Fan Zhiyi and Sun Jihai went to professional football in the 80s and early 90s. If you know a bit about modern China, you may know that the 80s were a unique period. It's the decade right after the Cultural Revolution. China was still very poor, but people couldn't wait to enjoy their freedom on the back of political and social relaxation. Market economy and world factory hadn't become a thing yet, so people pursued all kinds of lives and careers. Some became actors and actresses, some became writers and poets, and of course, some chose to be football players. This is not a eulogy for the good old days. In fact, the 80s were also a decade of growing pain, with a thriving black market and high inflation. The point I want to make is that the 80s is a rare moment in Chinese history where the government didn't tell people what they should do or what they should be. I mean, not telling them verbally, but by shaping social norms and channeling people towards a certain course of life. To illustrate my point, I'd like to draw attention to 3 characteristics of Chinese ancient society. They are the autocratic rule, the civilization of the bureaucracy, and the imperial exam system. I think of them not as distinctive forces independent of each other, but a triangle, with each side contributing to the stability of the overall structure. In my previous video, I talked about how the autocratic rule came into being since the Qin dynasty in the 2nd century BC. The autocracy of the emperor did come under attack during the 4th to 6th century, kind of overlapping with the crisis in the West Roman Empire. And then in the 10th century, China again split into multiple kingdoms. But the kings were also autocratic rulers. Autocracy not only survived in China, but it became even more robust out of the crisis and lasted for another 1,000 years. To understand why and how, we need to look at the other two characteristics of China's ancient society: civilization of the officials and the imperial examination. Civilization is the opposite to militarization, a tendency where political status is reserved for the military people who made conquests for the king or queen. For example, the first Count of Savoy, Humbert I, received his land near what's today Lyon and Geneva from the Holy Roman Emperor as a reward for his support in the emperor's war efforts. Similarly, the famous general during Japan's Warring States period, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, was given the title daimyo and the land near Osaka after he saved his master during a siege. It's not difficult to see why military leaders, rather than civilian officials, often occupy the most crucial roles in a royal court. Throughout Chinese history, successful military leaders were also given land and noble titles, just as in Europe and Japan. But since the 2nd century BC, things have changed. The emperor realized that he needs a group of civilian officials who don't know how to use a sword, but who can manage agriculture, construction, and bookkeeping for him, like his secretaries. Therefore, early on, China had a hierarchy for civilians and parallel to the existing hierarchy for soldiers. In just a few hundred years, the civilian officials came to dominate the hierarchy and thus the royal court, while the military commanders got downgraded to be their subordinates. Taming the military wasn't an easy task as we think of it today. Today, you won't be surprised to see Kathleen Hicks, a civilian, as the number 2 person at the Pentagon. Ursula von der Leyen, before she got the job at EU, was the defense minister of Germany. However, ancient kings and emperors couldn't make such appointments because they had to make the military people happy. Otherwise, they may risk being overthrown or even killed. For example, for a long time, the Ottoman sultans didn't dare to take away the privileges of the Janissary, an elite infantry group, because they were just so powerful inside and outside the palace. Obviously, it's in the ruler's interest to get rid of a hereditary and aggressive military class. And that's exactly what the Chinese emperors did throughout the years. The emperors gave those generals cool titles like the Flying Cavalry and Guardian of the West, but at the same time took away their land and privileges. Later on, the generals didn't even get those cool titles anymore. The cool titles now belong to the civilian elites. But in my opinion, the victory of the civilian elites wasn't set in stone until the introduction of the 9-rank system in the 3rd century AD. The 9 ranks combined the military hierarchy with the civilian hierarchy, but it clearly favored the latter. As an analogy, the 9 ranks are like the faculty ranks in a university. Working as a research scientist, you can be a senior staff member, but you may still want to join the faculty for reasons like salary, funding, and job security. In China, a successful military commander used to attain top jobs easily. But after the 9 rank system, killing enemies was no longer a priority, but instead finding a spot in the bureaucracy system, which is tightly controlled by the civilian officials. In Europe and Japan, knights and warriors are legendary figures. But in China, although there were many famous military figures in history, ordinary people wouldn't treat them like gods. I know you may think of Guan Yu or Yue Fei, but they were worshipped really due to some other reasons. For ordinary people, being a soldier is the least desirable career choice. Everybody wants to learn how to read and write so they can get a job in the government. The Chinese emperors also love to see its people stay away from weapons because the emperor wouldn't have to worry about a coup or assassination. If somebody invades the empire, then let's just pick someone from the camp and pray he knows how to fight a war. In fact, the civilization of the political machine not only put the military profession to a decline, but it also affected other aspects of the society as well. For example, since the Han Dynasty in the 2nd century BC, people started to play an ancient form of football called 蹴鞠. The sport was popular in military training as well because it involves teamwork and combat skills. But after 1,000 years, 蹴鞠gradually turned into an entertainment rather than a combat sport. Players would show off their football juggling skill to impress the audience. I think Neymar would be a bigger celebrity in China at the time than he is now. Similarly, Kendo and Kung Fu used to be a lot more serious and bloody in China, but they gradually got rid of the rough edges and tailored to the taste of the civilian class. To maintain such a powerful class of civilian officials, the Chinese monarch came up with a great invention, which is the imperial exam. On the internet a few years ago, I don't know if you heard of this guy named Roberto Navilis, who is claimed to be the inventor of school homework. Of course, this is a joke, and Roberto is just a fake person. Someone probably hates homework so much that he or she came up with a person to blame. We'll never know who is the first teacher that gave students homework, but I'm pretty sure that examination, as we know and hate it today, was first created in ancient China. Wikipedia says it was created by an emperor in 605 AD. But actually, the practice of giving all candidates the same set of questions appeared much earlier, in the late Han Dynasty in 130 AD. I know what you're thinking. Exams appeared so early in China not because Chinese people were born to be good at exams, but out of necessity, as government functions grew so quickly that the emperor ran out of relatives and friends to fill in those positions. Therefore, the most efficient way to select talents from the whole population is by giving a set of exams and degrees. By the 10th century or the High Middle Ages in Europe, China had already seen a problem with degree inflation. There were so many people who have passed the exam, got their degree, but had to wait for government job vacancy. In some cases, a candidate waited for 10 years before his assignment. By the time he walked into his office, he was already an old man. Bureaucracy has a life of its own and tends to reinforce itself. This is nowhere more profound than in ancient China, where the civilian government can always get the best and brightest from the country. I talked about the autocratic rule and civilization of China. But in reality, these things or changes rarely affected the life of an ordinary peasant. In an age without TV and newspaper, the average person had no idea what's going on in the royal palace, who gets promoted, or what sport do the royals play. But the introduction of the imperial exam was a game changer. All of a sudden, ordinary people saw a ladder by which they can move upwards by studying hard and taking the exam. So parents, rich and poor, started to send their kids to private schools. These private schools can be very expensive for a normal household. So if you have read some of the ancient Chinese poems or letters, you will find that many of them tell a similar story, like how one could pay off his student debt once he passes the exam, or how he could marry the richest family's girl once he gets a position in the government. Essentially, the whole society was mobilized around the imperial exam, and people's value and definition of success was pivoted towards the bureaucracy. Forget about being a YouTuber or an Instagram influencer. Go find a job at the government's mailroom. Well, you can definitely argue that it's a narrow definition of success. What about craftsmanship, business acumen, or seafaring skill? To a degree, today's China still resembles a lot with this ancient model of success. It's a strange mixture. On the one hand, Chinese people can be very unrealistic when it comes to the chance of achieving such a success. But on the other hand, Chinese people are extremely practical in day-to-day life. And it's not just China. Countries like Malaysia, Spain, Turkey all consider a 4-year university degree and a government job as a cure for all diseases. Seeing all the problems with the world today, I can even say that this narrow-minded idea about education and success is a blessing for many developing countries. A crude meritocracy is still better than anarchy. But for China, I think we're going a bit too far in this. There are a few Chinese words that I can't find an equivalent in English. 官本位 is one of them. It means bureaucratic officers always sit on top of the social ladder. Imagine these officers sit around a dinner table. People would measure how successful they are based on how far they are from that table. If you're a writer, you probably want to join the Chinese Writers Association. Don't mistake the Writers Association with nonprofits like the Association for Pet Obesity Prevention or the Association for Applied and Therapeutic Humor. The Chinese Writers Association is a run-of-the-mill government institution with hierarchies among members and government-appointed officers. On the one hand, if you're not a member of the Writers Association, no major publisher will take you seriously. On the other hand, being a member gives you a lot of hidden privileges and perks. In addition, the Writers Association is a springboard for other government jobs unrelated to literature. It's essentially a big waiting room of the main bureaucracy office. China has hundreds of institutions or associations like this, and one of them is the Chinese Football Association, or CFA. Hiring business professionals to manage sports associations is not uncommon in the world. But the last three presidents of the CFA consist of a Port Authority president, a former ping pong coach, and a former volleyball coach. As you can see, the CFA is really not about football, but about sending people through the government's revolving door. One sport that China is doing really well and the government didn't franchise is esports. 20 years ago in China, hardcore gamers were seen as mentally ill and were sent to rehabs. But now, gaming is generally accepted as a legit career, with decent salary and paid vacation. As an anecdote, this huge shift in public opinion was almost single-handedly facilitated by one person, Wang Sicong. Besides being famous for his outspokenness and countless love affairs, he used his money and influence to modernize China's gaming industry, which wasn't really an industry prior to him. He introduced common practices and regulations, set up salary standards, and maybe played too much League of Legends himself. But in the end, China now has a booming and lucrative esport industry, on the same level as South Korea and the US. How many Wang Sicong does it take to revitalize Chinese football? Like I mentioned in my previous video, China's growth is achieved at the cost of individuals' initiative, the desire to draw up one's own plan and implement it with one's own hand. Although we don't have an autocratic ruler anymore, but in my opinion, the vast majority of people in China still want some form of connection with the government, either directly or indirectly. People prefer jobs that are well paid and have the potential to earn certain government-recognized titles. The chance of earning some of the titles are even thinner than a Hollywood audition, but people keep on trying. Maybe one day, you will join them at the dinner table. Therefore, I felt a stirring of emotion when watching the interviews of young Chinese athletes like Zhang Jike, Fu Yuanhui, and Gu Ailing. Some of their behaviors and comments will never accept them to the government's door. But on their faces, you can tell that they don't care at all. They just love the sport so much. As more people achieve success on their own, rather than through the exam bureaucracy combo, the old fortress is being torn down piece by piece, as quietly as when it was built. The first time China almost made it to the World Cup is not 2001 or 1985, but in the summer of 1957. Only 8 years after the country's birth and 4 years after the Korean War. Back then, there was no seven-figure salary, no TV broadcast. The PRC wasn't even recognized by the UN yet. But during the qualifying game, everyone in China was holding their breath while listening to the radio. One recalled seeing a person willing to trade his bicycle for a ticket. A bicycle was a luxury item at the time, but no one took the offer. The country was sent into raptures after China defeated Indonesia with a 4-3. Although China lost in the second and the most important game, the coach of Indonesia, who is from Yugoslavia, spoke highly of Chinese players' perseverance and solidarity. Basically, he was taken by surprise, because almost none of the Chinese team was professional player. They play football as a hobby and were rounded up at the last minute to play for the country. After the game, the football players flew back from Myanmar to China. They were not being joked at or treated like losers as today's Chinese football team would be. People sent them flowers and letters of encouragement. They saw a bright future for Chinese football, as well as for this new country. In this new country, monarchy and dictatorship were gone. Chinese people believed that for the first time in their life, they can choose for themselves. Okay, it's the first video of 2023. I wish everybody Happy New Year and good luck to Chinese football.